What's going on, everyone? Thank you all for the support and positivity on my first video. I really appreciate it. I honestly didn't know what to expect, but I could not have asked for a better start. Even Senpai noted. This video is a follow-up to my previous review of the Eluktronics MAX-17, so if you haven't seen it already, I highly recommend you to go check it out first. As for this video, I will be answering some commonly asked questions about it and sharing some issues that I found over the past week. And finally, I'll be presenting even more benchmark scores and in-game performances that will both impress and disappoint you in unexpected ways. To start off, let's talk about the keyboard. In my previous video, I didn't cover it much in detail, so a lot of people are still curious about it. So here's a sound test of it. The keyboard certainly wasn't the highlight of this laptop. It had very short travel distance and no tactile feedback. The palm rest and the left and the right side of the keyboard remained cool at 30 degrees under heavy load, while the hottest area was between the I and the O keys, reaching up to 53 degrees. The glass precision trackpad feels smooth and responsive, but after a week of use, I noticed a bit of flex at the bottom corners, which I'm not a big fan of. I believe this is by design, but using MacBook Pro on a daily basis for work, it started becoming more and more noticeable. Moving on to speakers, here's a sound test of it. It hit around 72 decibels with the volume maximized. However, there was definitely a noticeable distortion at this volume, so I don't recommend cranking it up this high. Moving on to fan noise. The fan noise hit around 50 decibels when the fan boost was enabled, but we'll get into more details later when we get into gaming performance. Keep in mind though, these measurements were done with a phone mic, so they may not be the most accurate measurements. Before we move on to other tests, I'll briefly explain the 4 different performance settings so that you have a better idea of what's going on under the hood. The first one is the Eco mode, which can be selected by checking the Eco box as shown here. This restricts the CPU's TDP to 25 watts and stabilizes the GPU's temperature at around 70 degrees. By disabling the Eco mode, the 25 watt restriction was removed and the GPU's temperature increased to 75. One thing to note here is that the CPU temperature was able to reach up to 95 degrees as long as the NVIDIA GPU was not in use. However, when the NVIDIA GPU is being used, the CPU throttles at 80 degrees. And unlike the gaming mode and turbo mode, this mode allows the user to specify the fan curve. When the profile was set to gaming mode, the maximum temperature of both the CPU and the GPU went up by 5 degrees. And finally, the turbo mode bumps up the maximum CPU temperature to 95 degrees and further pushes the GPU temperature to 86 degrees. This mode also enables their Eluktroboost technology, which unlocks the thermal limits and increases the TDP. However, since the RTX 2070 model of the MAX-17 comes with the TDP fully unlocked at 115 watts, this only seemed to affect the thermal limits. To test the battery life on light browsing load, I set the machine to Eco mode and set the screen brightness to 40%. Then, I played a YouTube video non-stop until the battery died. The MAX-17 managed to last a little more than 7 hours in this test. Now, before we dive into the benchmark results and gaming performance, let's talk about some tweaks that we can do to try to improve the performance of the MAX-17. The first trick is to simply download more RAM. We'll start off by undervolting the CPU. For those who might not be familiar with it, it is essentially reducing the voltage given to the CPU so that it can perform more efficiently. Shaving off extra unnecessary voltage means less heat is generated, which means less thermal throttling, which eventually leads to better performance. Although undervolting is generally deemed to be safe, be cautious before proceeding and perform this at your own risk. The MAX-17 actually comes undervolted in BIOS at negative 50 millivolts, but I managed to attain stability at negative 125 millivolts using Intel's Extreme Tuning utility. Keep in mind, this value is specific to my unit, so you have to find your own sweet spot if you wish to do this. Whether this actually helps the MAX-17's performance will be shown later in this video. Of course, The GPU can also be undervolted, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll just turn on Eluktroboost and unlock the thermal limits and call it a day. I do want to point out an anomaly in my previous video, which said that the GPU seems to stabilize at 67 degrees, even though it should have been reaching at least 75 degrees. I ran the stress test multiple times but couldn't figure out the reason at the time. However, while running several benchmarks to make this video, I think I finally figured it out. It appears both the CPU and the GPU get throttled when the battery is under 40%, even if it's plugged in. And this is rather annoying because you'll be taking a noticeable performance hit while your laptop is charging from below 40%. I have seen one other person reporting this problem, but I cannot confirm if this is a widespread issue or not. So perhaps if you already have your MAX-17, please leave a comment down below and let me know. Now, onto the actual results. For each benchmark, I ran all 4 performance settings at both stock voltage and modified voltage to show how undervolting affects the performance. Starting off with the Cinebench R20, different performance settings had almost no effects on the scores with the exception of the Eco mode. This makes sense if you remember that the Eco mode limits the TDP to 25 watts, while the other 3 modes do not impose any special restrictions on the CPU as long as the GPU is not running. However, there was a consistent and noticeable improvement when the CPU was undervolted across all 4 profiles. Next is Firestrike. Fan boosting and undervolting had some impact on the performance, but it was hardly noticeable. We can also see a similar pattern in TimeSpy, which kind of makes sense given that the 2 benchmarks don't rely solely on the CPU or perform long enough to be significantly affected by GPU thermal throttling. Now, onto some in-game performance. For these, Fan Boost was always enabled on both gaming and turbo mode because auto fans eventually got just as loud as the Fan Boost mode. For Eco and Office mode, the quietest predefined fan curve was used. I'll be using Monster Hunter World on highest settings as an example to show if undervolting has any impact on gaming performance. Quite frankly though, it did not give any frame rate boost. This is likely because games depend more heavily on GPUs than the CPUs. However, it does manage to keep the CPU a few degrees cooler in turbo mode. So even though it doesn't have a significant benefit in gaming, it's still a great tweak to make to keep the CPU cooler in turbo mode and to boost CPU bound tasks. Now that we covered undervolting, we'll focus on comparing different performance settings for the remainder of this video. This is where things took an interesting turn. Note that these tests were performed with -125 mV CPU undervolt, and because I was running OBS to record, it took some frames away from the actual frame rate. And the result? Well, they were not what I was expecting at all. Before I tested anything, I was expecting to say at the end of this video, Eluktroboost, good, Eco mode, bad, hit that like button and subscribe. But here are the results from Monster Hunter again. You'll notice that the gaming mode and turbo mode had very little difference. Really confused? I fired up Resident Evil 2 Remake. Similar pattern here. No significant difference between turbo mode and gaming mode. That's interesting. Okay, what about GTA 5? No difference here. But wait, look at that Eco mode hold on its own. While I was distracted being disappointed at turbo mode, I completely overlooked the fact the Eco mode maintained a formidable performance. It managed to stay well over 80 FPS in both Resident Evil 2 and GTA 5, all while recording in OBS, keeping the CPU under 25 watts and keeping the GPU around 70 degrees at max settings. As a result, the fan noise dropped significantly from 50 decibels to low 40 decibels. Not bad. While I initially ran the tests in Eco mode as a joke, it turned out to be the most interesting result I've got. It's like going to a motorcycle race and seeing someone show up with a bicycle and still keeping up with the race. I can actually see myself playing games in Eco mode to keep my device cool, especially if I don't have headphones to block out the fan noise. Okay, let's dive back into what's going on with Eluktroboost mode. And just to prove that I actually have friends and don't just play single player games, here's me playing Overwatch with these 2 friendly bots. Once again, we see the same pattern. So what's going on here? Well, if you remember when I talked about the 4 performance settings, Office mode keeps the CPU limited to 80 degrees and the GPU around 75 degrees. But how does that compare to other laptops? According to notebookcheck.net, the MAX-17 hits around 80 degrees on the CPU and 74 degrees on the GPU while playing Witcher 3. But that's a 15-inch laptop. So how does it compare to a 17-inch laptop? The Razer Blade Pro equipped with RTX 2080 Max-Q appears to hit around 85 degrees on the CPU and 70 degrees on the GPU under heavy load. I know I'm not comparing apples to apples here, but in a sense, this office mode has enough thermal clearance to compete against other powerful gaming laptops at their max settings. Not to mention that this variant of the MAX-17 already has the full unlocked max PTDP of 115 watts. The gaming mode, on the other hand, already pushes 5 degrees past that 75 degree GPU limit that most other gaming laptops impose at their maximum settings. So the gaming mode is arguably already reaping the benefits of Eluktroboost, but just at 5 to 6 degrees lower. At this point, it should be no surprise to you why gaming mode and turbo mode perform so closely. What we should have been comparing all along was office mode versus turbo mode to understand the effects of Eluktroboost. Once I started comparing those two modes, my disappointment turned into a satisfaction and my faith in Eluktroboost was restored. Personally though, 95 degrees and 86 degrees on the CPU and the GPU respectively are a bit too high for my taste. So given the little to no performance hit on the frame rates, I would choose to play on the gaming mode over turbo mode, but that's just me. I hope you found all that information useful. Hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoyed it. There are also Amazon affiliate links down below, so please consider using them if you found this video helpful. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.